All right,
and
everybody.
my
This is
arms disarray. Sorry. Whoops,
okay.
Scoop.
No worries. Hi, guys. This is the Body and X in the Candid frame. I've been thinking about a new idea that I wanted to do with a YouTube channel, and it was the idea of talking about gear, but in a different way. And in a different way, I mean talking about photographs, which sounds surprising since we're talking about photography a lot of the time. But a lot of the stuff that I see on YouTube is talking about cameras in the abstract, talking about specs and features. But it's unfortunately, we're not seeing a whole lot of photographs. So I thought what I would do is I would talk to photographers who have been using pieces of equipment for a particular period of time and talk about specific features or attributes of a camera, of a lens, or some sort of accessory, but talk about how it makes a difference in the actual photographs, because I think that that's really where the rubber meets the road. And I've been kind enough to be joined by Jay Dickman, who's an amazing photographer. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a National Geographic photographer. He has produced co-authored probably one of the best books that I think there is on photography, called The Perfect Digital Photography, a book. It's one of the few books that I actually read cover to cover.
All
Um,
right.
I'm a big proponent of that book. So if you need a book on digital photography, that's the one to get. But Jay, thank you for joining us this morning, and I really appreciate you making the time for us.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on here next. We talked over the years, so and I appreciate the plug on the book. We kind of were biased that way too. So yeah, it was very well reviewed. So thanks.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So you're an Olympus Visionary, so you've been using a variety of different Olympus cameras over the years. What's the one we're going to be talking about today?
I've been using most recently the EM-1 Mark II. I've had it in my hands for about a month now. I'm just amazed by this camera, by several features, and I'm really glad to hear you doing a show on this because the equipment is there to get to the image, and that's what drives everything. And I've always tell people in my workshops that you really want the camera to be invisible, and where it's just strictly a conduit to what's happening out there, to what's going on in your brain. And that's what I love about this new camera they've come out with. It's less and less interference between the magic of the moment and the technical components of the camera.
We're going to be looking at some of your images in a minute, but why don't you tell people what kind of work that you do primarily, and what are some of the specific things that you're needing from your camera in order to produce those
Great.
kinds of photographs?
Yeah, the past few years I've been working with National Geographic quite a bit with their expeditions, workshops, adventures. These are trips that people can go on, workshops that people can go on, their trips around the world that people can go on there all over the world. People sign on, and of many of these trips they have a National Geographic photographer on board to provide their expertise. We lecture, we provide information on things photographic, and I'm still shooting heavily on these too, so it combines two things I love, which is talking about photography and shooting. I still go back to that, the image is what drives everything. I love to get to do these trips. This was a busy year, I'll tell you. It was 31 countries I've worked in. 10 of those were repeats, but a total of 31 countries I worked in. And the travel gets old. I get tired of the travel. I get tired of being gone from my home and my wife. And I go through this drill every time I get to that point of like being so tired of traveling. I reach down in my bag before I depart on the trip, and I pick the camera up, and it's still this electricity that goes through me. I get to do this. What I love about this Olympus system is I think this is the future of photography, mirrorless and these smaller systems. I travel extensively. I'm constantly carrying equipment on the plane. I'm not going to ship my equipment under the plane. And I've got on my website, on my Where's Jay blog, I have a piece I just recently wrote on traveling light, and it addresses a lot of this. And I show a photograph of my think tank bag full of my gear that is well within size restraints of international carry-on. And I'm carrying from a 14 millimeter equivalent out to 840 millimeters at f5.6 equivalent on the plane, 3 bodies, all the lenses, batteries, everything. So I get on my soapbox quickly about this because I think this is the future. My world is about high quality. It's got to be image quality high, great enough to address National Geographic needs, and this equipment does it. So I think that you define what you need in equipment, use that as your filter, and this equipment works incredibly well for me.
Well, let's just jump into discussing the photographs. Let me pull up the screen share, and then we can talk about that balance between the idea of having something that's fairly compact and fairly small, but that still delivers image quality. Because I think a lot of people who may be watching these videos have cut their teeth in photography with DSLRs. And I know that there's sufficient amount of talk out there in terms of mirrorless cameras and their advantages in terms of their compact size and that. But I think that one of the biggest questions for me is what compromises, if at all, do you have to make as a result of going to a smaller design, and is image quality one of them? So, all right,
Sure.
let me pull up the screen share. And can you see the Lightroom desktop?
Yep, I'm looking at it.
All right, so why don't you tell me which one of the pictures you want to start with, and we'll move from there.
Well, let's go to what's a good one to start. We'll go with the New York picture at the end because that was very, very recent. This was just a couple of weeks ago. There's one feature this new Olympus Mark II has, which is an image stabilization that if you use their 12-100 lens, which is equivalent to a 24-200, that you get up to 6.5 stops image stabilization. This is shot out my hotel window. My wife and I were in New York a week and a half ago or so. One of the last nights we were there, it's a 3.5 second exposure, or 3 seconds, sorry, handheld looking out the window. I shot a few frames. I was trying to shoot the 3 seconds to get that blur of the traffic going by. And you look at the dynamic range in this image too. And this is one of the critical components that is so important for me. Is that camera's got to have that dynamic range, that capability of capturing light to dark. So you have detail in the buildings up there towards the left. You have detail in the clouds. You have detail in the highlights of the cars going by. This used to be an argument against a smaller sensor, like a 4/3 sensor, that the dynamic range wasn't good enough. And the noise issue, there was a noise issue. Well, those arguments used to be valid up to 5 or 7 years ago. And as this technology keeps moving forward, those arguments, that division is less and less and less. I want the camera in my hands when I need it. And that's the beauty of this Micro Four Thirds system, is that the camera's with me when I want to shoot it. And until they change, until the law of physics is changed, what's going to dictate the size of one's camera kit, camera bag, are the lenses, essentially. And that's the beauty of this system, is my lenses are so much smaller. I always work with 2 cameras when I'm out shooting. I carry a 12-40 on one and a 40-150 on the other. And with a dual Black Rapid strap system I use, I can carry them and work with them all day. And they're there when I need them. What's the best camera to have? It's the one that is in your hands when you need it. So I think this photograph illustrates that amazing image stabilization that this camera offers. 3 seconds handheld. I'm shoulder into the window, but still, that's an amazing image, and it is sharp. It's not one of those images you look at and go, oh, that's kind of sharp. The image is tack sharp, and the dynamic range is there. Everything is there on this. And I print my images sometimes up to 30 by 40 or larger, and these files hold up beautifully for that.
Tell me about the exposure, because you're dealing with, like as you said, a wide dynamic range, and I assume that you're shooting raw. But tell me about, in terms of handling the exposure, so that you can retain the detail and the highlights and the shadows. Are you relying on the multi-pattern metering of the camera in order to achieve that? Are you biasing the exposure in any way?
This one was shot about 3/10 plus. you never use the monitor on any camera to determine exposure. It's just to check composition, because they're not always accurate. So I use my histogram. So I'll shoot one test image quickly, get an idea of the image. And I've been shooting 45 years, and I'm from a film background, trust me, and I'm from a 35 millimeter world, or whatever equipment you need to get the job done. But I took this photograph, or I took a kind of a quick test image, look at the histogram, added about 3/10 of a stop to it, because I wanted to open up the shadows a little bit. I knew those car lights would be streaked, so it wouldn't be quite as potential blowout on that. Mm-hmm. So it was just, you bring a lot of information into this game when you shoot. It's just the knowledge of having shot similar situations before. And one of the great lessons for me as a photographer was like shooting for National Geographic with slide film that had no latitude for error. So I learned to expose correctly early on, trusting and loving my hand light meter. So when digital came along, it was a beautiful transition, because you do have a little bit more latitude for error with digital. And then you have these magical tools in Lightroom or Photoshop. I do a lot of work still in Photoshop, of the highlight shadows tool, which is magical. And this brings you that technological power to make the image look like you saw it in your mind's eye when you press the shutter. So it was a combination of things, of checking the histogram, knowing an exposure like this, that kind of made it work.
And what was the ISO that you were shooting at for the?
This is in Tribeca. Is that what you asked?
Oh, no, what was the ISO?
ISO on this was, I'd have to go look at, I think it's either native 200 or maybe higher. I'd have to go look. But there is really not any objectionable noise in the shadows or anything. And this is an interesting point. One of the critical components of digital, especially with low light, dark exposures, if your exposure has to be accurate. A lot of people coming from the film world approach digital with the idea that I'm gonna underexpose to get all that information. That's counterproductive, because your most of your information in the digital file resides towards the right side of the histogram. Right. So it's really absolutely critical to get your exposure correct on micro four thirds or on full sensor or whatever else, because you exacerbate noise issues. Noise comes from the blue channel. Images are made of red, green, and blue. So if you underexpose, you're making things worse.
One of the issues that that sometimes is a concern for people is that with the micro four thirds system, is because it's a smaller sensor, that it is noise can be more of an issue at really high ISOs, or when you're underexposed and you try to open it up. What's been your experience with respect to that?
I think if you expose correctly, this is a critical thing, because people tend to go into dark situations and I need to get a dark image. No, you need to get an image correctly exposed, or actually slightly overexposed. I'm talking in the 3/10 of a stop or less. And I think that's a critical component. I could show you some images. I wish I'd thrown one in there. I'd photographed up in close to Northwest Passage a year ago, a gentleman doing a traditional game up there, and I shot it at 6400 and correctly exposed it, and it's clean. It's amazing to look at that image. But again, people have that issue. They underexpose, and then they try to open things up, and you start getting more noise. And I'll sacrifice that tiny little difference that the larger sensor may give me to having that camera in my hand when I need it. This to me is the biggest thing. Is you never know when a photograph is going to present itself to you. So I want to have that equipment with me when I see that image.
Yeah. Well, the image stabilization feature is really sort of interesting in a lot of cameras, but especially this one.
This is amazing. Yeah, go to the one of the third, number 7, if you would. I could talk about that for a second.
Okay.
So this is in outside of Kyoto in Arishiyama, a bamboo forest. And I'm photographing early morning, took a couple of people out there, and I've got one camera on my tripod set up and shooting this forest. And all of a sudden I hear this motorcycle coming up behind us, and I had the lens I wanted on my Mark II. My tripod had an EM-1 on it. So I just grabbed the my EM-1 handheld Mark II with a 7-14, I believe, was on this one, and just kind of hung onto the tripod, hand holding the camera. And this was 8 seconds. This is an 8-second,
8 seconds, wow.
yes, essentially handheld exposure. I was braced physically against the tripod, but it's still 8 seconds. It's kind of surrealistic how well this stuff works. I mean, there's, I think you had to, stop my heartbeat and everything else on this to make it work. And it's not always going to work, but on those moments where it's like, I heard this is a one-time event. If you look right at the kind of where the lights bend, you'll see blur of somebody walking through the image. But look at the detail in the bamboo, in the vertical shafts of bamboo on the right and mid side of the frame. They are sharp. So again, and I use my tripod regularly, but there are those moments where I may be out somewhere and the situation's going to present itself to me where I don't have my tripod, or like this, where something happens so quickly that you've got to react with the equipment that's in your hands. So this came to fruition because of that image stabilization ability. And this was 200 ISO, 8 seconds, f11 or so, very low light in the early morning.
That's one of the things that appeals to me about this particular system is the image stabilization, because I am so obsessed with my minimum shutter speed, because I am constantly having to contend with low light situations, but trying to ensure that I have a reasonably fast shutter speed so that I don't create this camera shake, because there's nothing worse than thinking you have a great image and then later on you see that it's blurred because you move the camera because of a too slow shutter speed. And one of the ways that I have to contend with it is by working with higher ISOs. Typically, when I'm shooting on the street, I'm at least at 400 and sometimes go to 800, 1600 in order to ensure that I have at minimum 200 or 250th of a second. Do you find that is less of a need for you to go to the higher ISOs because of the image stabilization feature of the cameras?
Man, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it lends itself to it. I also shoot slow shutter speed a lot. Boy, I love my tripod when I need it. I use that Acrotech ball head, incredible ball head when I need it. But like I said, these situations, and I found that I can, especially with wide, I can get down into the 15th, eighth of a second situation if there's not a lot of blurring movement going on that you don't want in there. But this camera system gives you that ability to shoot into a slower shutter speed. And there's kind of an old trick you can use too, I found, when you're shooting really slow shutter speed, maybe it's a static scene, is you shoot in burst mode. So that maybe that first frame is going to bounce a little bit, but your second, third, fourth frames, the camera settle down. But on this particular picture, it was just one frame and the guy was gone. So I was kind of hoping that, but to have that equipment provide the technical stability so that you can get that image, because this is exactly what I saw. I was like, oh my gosh, that's going to look so cool if he drives through there and if he puts his brake lights on, and he did it. He just went through. So yeah, and the old rule of thumb was in film days that you took your lens length, and if it was a 24 millimeter lens, well, it was maybe 1/24th of a second. If it was a 300, it was 1/300th. I think those rules have been turned upside down, giving the photographer that much more capability of photographing what they see, and without the interference sometimes of what a tripod can give you. Because I like to be fluid, I like to move around, be able to oh, look at that, boom, you react immediately. So it's a powerful tool that this camera gives you to be able to drop down to that slow shutter speed and get the image like you see it.
You were mentioning that how slow of a shutter speed you could go with when you're using like wide angle lenses. When do you have to start considering other choices, specifically related to like focal length, as you go up in focal length choices, say from 85 millimeters and up? At what point are you sort of having to consider increasing your ISO as opposed to depending on the image stabilization feature of the camera?
And my answer to almost all those questions, when you get into the aesthetic end, it depends. What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to get movement in there? Are you trying to record the scene if it's static? So it always depends on the situation. There's another photograph, it's a vertical of a red shrine with some people in front of it, second to the last. That was the Torii Shrine off of, what was that island? I've got it right here. It's Tsukushima Island off of Hiroshima. And I was wandering around. We went back out. I was with a group. Went back out to see dusk. We didn't have the ability to go get our tripod. So I've got some folks over here photographing. So I walked out towards the beach area and saw this scene. It was so cool. It's like you have that perfect blend where you get the late daylight, ambient light with introduced lights. You started working with complementary colors, and you get, which is psychologically appealing to us. And I saw this scene. I'm confirming this right here. This was shot with effectively a 90 millimeter lens, shot at 1.6 of a second. Shot vertically, handheld with the image stabilization. Again, you can see the gentleman's head is a little bit blurred right middle. The people in the kind of the center, she's sharp as a tack. The decoration on the Torii Shrine in the background is sharp as a tack. And again, this is one of those things where you're moving all the time, trying to get, I like how the shrine's reflected between the sets of people. I like the shadows of the people in the foreground. You're constantly thinking, you're building the photograph. What's working in this? What's not working in this? So now you're shooting with a 90 millimeter, which should be, the old rule was 1/90th of a second. You don't want to go under that. Now all of a sudden I'm down into something several times slower than that, and I'm able to get the frame. How much more power do you want in the equipment than to be minimal weight on you and to be with you when you want it and allow you to get images like this?
So you've mentioned a couple of times about having the use of a tripod with a camera that's capable of giving you such advantages in terms of image stabilization. What is it, about 5 stops, or is it as high as 7?
I believe with the 12 to 100, I believe Olympus is saying that it's 6.5. I think it's 5 to 5.5 with the other lenses.
Okay, so considering you have a camera that gives you that much more flexibility in terms of what shutter speed you can use, when do you make the conscious choice to use a tripod rather than relying on the IS?
It depends. So I'm going to blow off that answer again, but no, it really does depend. It depends on what the situation is. And at times, you bet I'll put a tripod up when I have to have that long exposure if I'm shooting a star scene or whatever. And it depends on that particular moment. So we're always, you're looking at the situation, you're reacting to it accordingly. It's funny because that's an exact term I use in the workshops all the time. Somebody asks me something about aesthetics. What do I need to do to accomplish this? It depends. What are you trying to accomplish? If I go into if I'm photographing looking down on a traffic circle in a city or something, I want to get that full blur. By preference, I'd want to have a tripod set up, you bet, because that's going to ensure that I'll be able to get it. But what if I'm out and I don't have the tripod? All of a sudden, you now have the equipment in hand that can give you that slow exposure so you can start getting that world of image made, that type of image made with just the camera.
Okay. My screen share went out for a second, so let me just reconnect that and then we'll continue here.
Technology is wonderful when it works, isn't it?
It works, right. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the advantages of the compact size of the camera. Do you have an image here that we could talk with?
Yeah, go to the puffin picture, the one on the number 2.
Okay.
So this was shot earlier in summer on Vigar Island in the West Fjords of Iceland. So this was shot, this is a puffin with a bunch of sand eels in its beak. And I hope it looks good on everybody's computer because this thing is just outrageously sharp. It doesn't appear it quite here, but I was photographing on a geographic trip, went to this island, which is known for its bird life, beautiful little island, and saw these puffins flying in and out off of this little rocky outcrop by the water. So I went over there and they all flew away, and I had my 300 millimeter on, my 300 millimeter f4, and I put the 1.4 converter on it. So that gave me effectively in a full sensor world 840 millimeters of lens at f5.6, which is very realistic for a wildlife lens. So I sat there for over an hour. I'd scoot forward a little bit. The puffins would fly off, reacting to my movement. they'd settle down, they'd fly back and land. It took me about an hour until I was able to get this vertical image of this bird looking at me with these sand eels in its beak. So this is, again, one of those benefits, because I was able to move, sit, let them get used to me, move forward again. The ground was not really, it did not lend itself to having used a tripod. This was midday. I didn't want to carry a tripod in midday when I'm photographing anyway. But that's the beauty of this system, that this 300 f4 is 13 inches long, something like that. It's about, the size of a lot of 35 millimeter 300 f4s. So it's just a phenomenal lens. This lens is outrageously sharp. It's a very real world wildlife lens. And I do a lot of work in Africa and everywhere else. And this has become my go-to lens there. But again, I didn't have the luxury of a tripod. I'm trying to get this image of this very cool scene of the bird with the sand eels in its beak, and the equipment, the presence of that equipment, that 300 f4 with the 1.4 on it, gave me effectively a 840 millimeter lens, allowed me to get this image that I don't think I would have gotten if I'd sat there with a 600 full frame lens in my hand. I couldn't have done this. I could not have sat there for an hour waiting for this image to appear.
Talk about the size and weight, because one of the things I think about is that with these cameras being so much smaller and lighter, that you can take more gear with you. It doesn't weigh as much, but that kind of defeats the purpose of working lighter and more minimalistically. How do you sort of balance that out for yourself in terms of
Well, it's a good one, yeah, because when our kids were growing up, we had a Chevy Suburban, and the Suburbans were great. It's like, oh, you've got all the space in the world, but you're still going to fill it. You fill whatever space you get. So what I love about this is that I often try to really minimize what I'm carrying. And like I said, I often work with the 12 to 40 and the 40 to 150 as my two lenses. I always go back to, you look at what Cartier-Bresson and Danny Lyons and Robert Frank and all these photographers from the 50s and 60s and back into the 40s were doing with a 35 millimeter, maybe a 28 millimeter lens, and that was it. We had the luxury of these incredibly sharp lenses that give you this huge range. And I think that by minimizing what you carry, you're maximizing your photographic potential, because then it's not about the equipment in my bag. Oh, I've got this, I've got 11 lenses in there, and I'm looking for a photograph that lends itself to the lens. I'm looking at the situation, thinking, how can I work this situation and get the image? Sometimes your best zoom lens are your legs. So you work, and I think, again, by minimizing, it's all about the picture then, and it's about what's going on in my head, and I don't let the equipment get in the way. I don't have a 18-pound bag hanging on my shoulder. I carry I carry a minimal amount of equipment with me. I've got a little think tank bag I carry with me if I need to, that I've got maybe my 7 to 14 and my 1.4 in it. And the equipment is getting out of the way, which is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be about the image.
Let's talk a little about exposure, because you talked about in the initial images about writing the exposure compensation in order to achieve a good photograph. Like for example, here this scene I think is really interesting photographically, and it's got these wonderful highlights on the edge, but you have some of the iceberg that is sort of in shadow detail. And with this, it's really important to be able to retain that highlight detail.
Yeah.
Rather than getting blown out, because if your sheen is dominated by midtones or shadow, the exposure can get biased for that.
Yeah.
So tell me about, to what extent you had to sort of fine tune the exposure here.
Well, this was in Greenland, Ilulissat, the ice fjord. It's just an absolutely amazing place. It's one of the largest glaciers and most active. I think it's the most active glacier in the world. And this is the result of some of the output of that. You have these amazing ice fields, and I'm photographing this with the 300 millimeter f4 again. And one doesn't normally think of a 600 as a landscape lens, but I'm on a boat. We're scooting along quite rapidly, going through these fjords. And I looked up and saw this situation. I was like, oh my gosh, and this is full frame, probably 95% of what I'm showing you is uncropped. I'm a real believer in cropping when you shoot. We all crop, of course, but I think if you go in with the discipline that when you crop when you shoot, it makes you a better photographer. Understanding exposure is a critical aspect. Yeah, your point is exactly right on this. This could be a nightmare of lighting conditions here because you have direct sun coming from the top right on ice. And if anybody's photographed that before, that is, you've got specular highlights that are essentially gone, and you have a shadow detail in here. And this did not take much work in Photoshop. This is a little bit of movement on the highlight and shadows tool, but not much at all, like 10 under to get this. But it's, again, understanding that exposure when you see the scene, and we're moving quickly, and there's about a 10-second window to get this thing. So a friend of mine said that the thing she loves about photography, it's all problem solving. So you look at this scene, it's like, oh, I love the vertical aspect. Well, this is a vertical image. Okay, look at this light going on in here. Well, what do I need to do on this? Well, this is one where I think this was 3/10 of a stop under, and there was no time to think this thing out. The scene was gone in a second, but it looked like Hall of the Mountain King to me, and just this ethereal blue. So it was the thing of looking at the situation again, knowing like, well, I'm going to have a little bit of blowout on that ice, so I better approach that, and the waterfall coming out too, the water splashing out. I didn't want that to be completely blown out. So it is that thing of knowing that situation in a really limited time and just reacting to it. You know, when you see a situation, another friend of mine, photographer friend, that says when you see a situation that makes you go, wow, or makes you go, oh, look at that, you should think about photographing it. And that's what's always been, I've always used as kind of the catalyst. And on this scene, you know, we're photographers. Our world is seen through the camera. I always hear people say, don't you put your camera down and enjoy the scene. Well, my thinking is the camera's taking me that much more deeply into the scene. I see the beauty of it. Trust me, I'm a photographer. You and I are both photographers. But when you pick that camera up, it's that luxury of looking at it, that situation, going, what's resonating here? What's magical about this? So again, I'm always trying to think about, we tend to, the aspiring photographer especially tends to look at a situation when something very cool is happening. We tend to center it. And I think this is when something wonderful is happening, very electric, and you have that second or few seconds to think about it. Shoot the obvious scene. Don't miss the moment. But then look at that image after you grab it and think, how can I improve this? Well, I want to get the top of the ice in there. I want to just have that little bit of ice feature at the top. I want to have enough on the left to have space from which the water can flow. I want to give it some breathing room at the bottom. I want the right side of the frame to be finished. So we build, we're like visual choreographers. We build the image as we sit there and look at it, if you have that luxury.
Yeah, it's amazing composition. I mean, just considering that you have no control over what's in front of you, you frame it so it's just beautifully balanced with just it just flows.
Isn't that just, I mean, I don't care if it's my picture, but look at that. Isn't that just an amazing scene? A friend of mine was with me, another guy named Rick Hunter, a great photographer, and he probably had the same picture. It was just like, but you've got to react, and your camera has to be ready. And this is one thing I tell people in my own workshops and everything else. When that camera goes on around your neck, to me, it's like a switch goes on in your head. You're thinking and seeing photographically. My camera's set. We're on a boat moving. Well, I shot NFL football for years, and the old rule of thumb there was at 1/500th of a second to start stopping action. So I knew that I needed that at least as a minimum. We're on a boat moving. Well, I'm going to double that shutter speed. I think I'm up to, I think I was 1250th or maybe as high as 1600th of a second on this, because I knew I had 2 points of motion, the background and our boat and the water falling out. So when these things happen, you are ready for it to capture it.
And that makes an excellent point, because people can think fairly one-sided. They're thinking about image stabilization in terms of, avoiding camera shake and thinking they can use it at a slower shutter speed, but they're not thinking in terms of the reciprocal, in terms of what they want their image to look
Exactly.
like. And so you always have to consider that as well.
And that's where it goes back to my answer when it goes to aesthetics is it depends. And that makes sense now that, what are you trying to achieve with this? These technical tools become very much a creative tool for the photographer.
Let's talk about this portrait of this woman here. It's very, very striking.
This was in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago. It was at the Temple of the Tooth Relic, which is a very famous temple in Candid in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is an amazing country, wonderful people, amazing people. And there's a small little prayer area outside. And that's where they light their candles and say prayers before they go in. And I just sat there for a while, and this is one of those things. I mean, photographing people can be a tough condition. I tend to get along with people well. I always suggest, you make eye contact with somebody. And I saw this woman, she was just striking looking with those incredible eyes, and she sat to pray. And I shot this with my 40 to 150. And I was behind the candles looking in, and I was just struck by the power of her eyes. It's like, oh my gosh. And I saw a study done once on what we look for in photographs. And one of the very first things we look for are eyes. Then we look for sharpness, and we look for diagonals. But when you bring eyes in, you force an interaction with your audience. I mean, now that I've said that, look how your eyes go to her eyes. And you think of Steve McCurry's famous photograph of the African girl with the green eyes. Everybody knows that picture. But by being aware of, again, and I think that what we do as a photographer is we build our image. So every component in here hopefully lends itself to kind of the photograph succeeding or not. I mean, the candles information, her hands in prayer information, those wonderful eyes, and that little tuft of hair on the right side of the frame, I think finishes off that, as does the left. So again, we build our photographs to visual fruition.
In this scene, the way I'm seeing it is looks like the area behind her is much brighter. You can see the highlight
Yep.
in her hair. So there is a difference of probably at least a couple of stops between
Yep.
where she is and the background. So in a scene like this, you definitely want to expose for her face. And
Yep.
we've talked about in a couple of other images how you'll do an initial shot and look at the histogram and make an adjustment. But with something like this, it's a moment that can be very fleeting. So what do you rely on to ensure that you get a well exposed shot that allows you to retain that detail when you may not have the flexibility of being able to do a test exposure and check your histogram?
And this is a perfect example of that. And again, it's knowing, having shot similar situations to this, I knew kind of where I needed to bias the light. And I was also cognizant of the background behind those people. And this is something that a lot of aspiring photographers can struggle with, because you've got to be, technically, you have to know what camera and software is capable of capturing. Our eyes in art and in photography always go to the brightest area. So if this area is blown out behind her, it's not going to work, because that's going to draw your eyes. Right now, our highlights are her eye. Look at the eye, the white of her eye. That's the highlight there. So that's that. In addition to how we always look at eyes, that brings your eyes to her eyes. And I was very aware of the background, because if I shot from left or right a little bit further off angle, I would have had a blown out background that would not have worked on that. So you're always thinking. Photography is problem solving. What's wrong with this? How can I get this right? Well, you've got to be aware of, and I always tell people in workshops too, that you're responsible for every square centimeter of that frame. And it's that responsibility of being cognizant of what's going on. It's just working the situation. Well, if I move left 2 inches or right, it's going to make all the difference. And it's that constant working the situation. I did crop off a little bit on this. Just want to let your audience know that, just left and right, 5% maybe. But this is essentially what I saw when I shot it. And it's interesting, because I as a film person, coming from a film background, and I've been shooting digital since 2003, but having come from that background, a lot of film purists say, well, they don't like digital because it's not pure photography. What's the difference? It's about moment, it's about composition, it's about palette, it's about structure, it's about all these things that make a photograph work. And now you have these tools within this technology so that it allows you to make the image look like you saw it when you press that shutter. How much more power do you want? There were some, I have 3 images in my presentations of classic, famous black and white images. Ansel Adams' Moonrise over Hernandez, famous black and white photograph from, I think it was Life magazine, of James Dean in New York, and another photograph of Muhammad Ali. And when you see the originals of these, and then you see the instruction print that the photographer created for the corrections to make, and then you see the final image, you know, they would have loved Photoshop to have been able to make those corrections because they were nightmare prints. So we have this amazing tool now to make the image look like we wanted it to look.
Do you find that in terms of metering that you largely rely on the multi-pattern metering for the most part, and that center weighted or spot are rarely used?
Yes, that's exactly how when I shoot, I almost generally always fall in that, because if you shoot enough, you understand the biasing that should go on. Do I need to be plus? Do I need to be minus? You know, I think Confucius said that, you know, the craftsman knows his tools well. And that is so true, that if you shoot enough, or you start to understand exposure, and those errors you make can be some of the most instructive components as a photographer, because when you make that mistake, you have that metadata file that can tell you, well, wow, look at that. I've got blur in this. Well, I remember Jay Dickman talking about 1/500th of a second. Well, I was at 2/50th. So this is all information, but exposure, like I said, I learned to expose on slide film, and my 36 exposure roll of film, the pictures may not be 36 perfect moments, but they were 36 correctly exposed images. So I took exposure out of that dynamic. And this is one reason I'm a real believer in auto ISO too. I think it's, you know, greatest thing since canned beer. The exposure is made up of ISO, shutter speed, aperture. Let the camera do the lifting on the heavy lifting on the ISO. It's always going to default to lowest ISO possible. You can bracket it if you want. But having said that, it depends. There will be situations where I'll set my ISO, but on situations like this, I was in auto ISO because I knew, and I can look at my exposure looking through the camera, and I shoot a lot of stuff in shutter priority. I know a lot of photographers love aperture. I love shutter. A lot of my work is about moment. But again, which is the ideal exposure mode to use? It depends. What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, it's so important to have a recognition of not just what you're shooting, but how you shoot it.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about this one. This is a fascinating picture.
This was in Sri Lanka, and it was in Weligama, which is below Colombo, the capital city on the southern end of the island. But it's these very classic stilt fishermen that a lot of them are doing it legitimately. Some of these today, you know, there's so many people photographing this that do it for pay. But these guys, we watch them, and I went, they were selling their sardines on the street. But I was working a situation, and I wanted to get just kind of that image. It just kind of brought everything together. And I wanted to get the fluidity of the water, you know. So I had a Stingray very ND filter, so I could change, you know, lose light. You know, usually you want to gain light, but sometimes you want to get rid of light. So this is on a tripod now, because I was moving, and I set the thing, had the tripod going 1 second, and and it's interesting because, again, sharpness is such a critical component of photography that if our eye finds sharpness in the frame, we accept a lot of the blur as an aesthetic component. So, you know, you've got these little devices, they're standing on these stilts, and the one in the middle has a lot of sharpness. The guy on the left has got sharpness. The guy on the right has sharpness. But I brought in the information, and again, we build images. You know, you look at the left. I want to go left to right, top to bottom. I wanted the clouds in there as an important component because it helped to give kind of a sense for this lushness of the day and this shining reflection of the sun shining on these clouds on the top left, reflecting on, giving this wonderful backlight, this highlight on the left side of the frame. Got get those wonderful trees on the right. So and it's so fun. I mean, this is such a cool craft in which we all love partaking, that you build the picture. You're looking, well, what do I want on the right side? What do I want on the left? What do I want at the bottom? I wanted to make sure there weren't any rocks in the foreground, because just a couple inches below this, there were rocks. So it's one of those pictures when I shot it and looked at it, it's like, oh my gosh, this is it. But it is something that I see a lot of aspiring photographers have issues with, is they tend to look at the images too much. They tend to, what that chimping term, ooh, look at that picture. And the danger of that is it can take you out of that moment when you're looking at the image, and all of a sudden the guy pulls up a fish and you miss it because you're admiring your work. You use that monitor to confirm composition, use a histogram to confirm exposure. Then once you get those things down, then you stay with the situation until you get the moment. But this is also kind of a layered image, because there's information, look in the background, you see some of the other fishermen on the poles back there. So it goes back to that thing again, that we're responsible for that view, for that everything going on in the viewfinder.
Yeah. To what degree does post-processing influence your work, especially considering that if you're shooting for National Geographic, you're probably having to adhere to a lot of the sort of the principles that photojournalists have to adhere to in terms of minimal manipulation of the image. How does that sort of factor in when you're looking at a scene, knowing that you may not be able to massage it to the extent that some, enthusiasts might?
Yeah, I mean, there are scenes you see where you just know, even if you ramped up the highlight shadows tool to its maximum, which would make it look ridiculous. And some of those scenes I may shoot, but I may never address it. But I looked at this scene, I knew there's not that much post done to this. Again, this is pretty darn close to what the scene looked like, what the raw file. And you mentioned that earlier, that I probably shoot in RAW. I shoot exclusively in RAW. It gives you almost 2 stops more dynamic range to begin with. It allows you to open up those shadows, bring down the highlights, which it's not done that much, because and that's one reason photographers love shooting early and late, is the dynamic range at light to dark is more compressed. You've got the sun coming up. This is it was just before sunrise, but the sun is bouncing off the clouds up in the background, giving that wonderful, luscious, shimmery part on the left. But you just, and the benefit of shooting in those humid conditions like that is the sun, even just pre-sunrise, the sun's going through all that background light, through all that atmosphere, that particulate matter, making it creating a huge light bank. In Colorado, I live in Colorado, and in summer and in winter, or especially in winter, when you get those cold fronts come through that clears the air out of all that particulate matter, the sun becomes more of a singular light source and becomes very hard and harsh. But here you have that luxury of that huge light bank that a vast amount of humidity in the air creates, giving you this beautiful, soft. I mean, look at the light on that post in the center. I just love looking at pictures when you start breaking them down. But it's understanding light and working that light to your advantage.
So that light is the light of the sun just creeping up over the horizon?
The sun's behind me. And what's happening, you see the cloud that goes up out of the frame in the kind of the mid top left. Mm-hmm. At the top of that cloud, that's why I kept it out of there, it was catching the sun. The sun is bouncing light back down in there. That's what's causing that highlight on the left. So I didn't want to have that cloud in there up there, because that would have been blown out. But again, it's bouncing up there, lighting that up, but that light's coming down here. But again, going through that vast amount of particulate matter of water vapor in the air, which softens the light up further.
That's amazing, because I look at this shot and I'm saying, how was this lit? Because I can see that the guys in the foreground are really well illuminated. I'm going, did he use flash? And then they'll go, no, the figures that are in the distance, they're just as well illuminated. So it's no way he could have used.
No, and now having further talked about it, I'm almost positive the sun had just come up, because look at the bag on the guy in the center, and look at the little bit of wood exposed at the bottom, and the same thing on the unoccupied still. There's just that little bit of warm light. So I'm pretty sure now that that sunlight is just coming over the horizon when this was shot.
Pays off to get up early.
Yeah, that's what I hate about this stuff. You have to wake up early. Yeah, you could go to, yeah, that was a fun one. That was recently shot just after I got the Mark II. I was in New York for the presentation of the camera. Then I had to go to Pennsylvania for Olympus for a meeting. And I flew from there to Chicago, then to Seattle for a talk. And then I flew back home Sunday night from Seattle. Then I left Tuesday morning for Japan. But this was flying into Chicago from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I always love it when you fly into Chicago, especially at night, when you get that grid work that just is magical looking. And you've got just a little bit of sunlight, a little bit of dawn coming up in the background. I'm shooting out the window, and this was, let me see if I've got this. This was a 1/10 of a second. The rivets, that's the wing of the plane. It's a small commuter jet. But I just love this diagonal going through here, kind of at a diagonal, bisecting, not bisecting completely the picture, but with that amazing grid work of the city below. And again, it's interesting because I have another version of this that I shot at like 2 seconds. It was too much blur because to me it just took away that. But what was amazing about it is that the rivets on the plane at 2 seconds handheld shooting out the window are sharp still. The background's all blurry. It was too much blur. This is kind of where everything kind of combined to give me what I had seen that was so attractive to me.
And that's very cool because you can see in the highlights, particularly right near the lower right-hand corner where the lights meet, I guess, the shoreline, and that slight blur serves as a great counterpoint to the sharpness of the wing and the rivets on the wing.
Exactly, and that's again where you take ownership. Like, well, what am I trying to convey? Well, I love this, and just that little bit of blur, and you've got still sharpness on which your eye can settle, and together, I think it makes just an interesting picture.
Okay, we have one more left, I think. Yeah, and this is just like you gotta you look at this picture and you want to know the story immediately.
Excuse me. This was on a geographic expedition. We were in the South Pacific on off the island of Niue. And beautiful, oh my gosh, beautiful waters. I'm a diver, but we were snorkeling in this area. And it's a legendary area because it's home to large colonies of banded sea kraits, which are they told me, very non-aggressive, extremely toxic sea snake. They're about 10 times the toxicity of a cobra, but they're supposedly very, very passive critters. So I'm snorkeling in the water. I'm using my EM-1 on this, and I've got it in underwater housing with a dome port with my 7-14, effectively 14 millimeters. There's a lot of, holy cow, we could go into a whole thing on underwater photography, but I've got the dome port on it, which is the curve that you've seen that, or photographers know it's a big curve port because it allows the lens to stay to its true millimeter length when you're shooting underwater. You get an error effect when you're underwater. If you have a flat port, that your lens effectively becomes a little bit longer. So this is shot with a 14 millimeter. I was swimming with these snakes for about an hour or so, and they were coming up all around me, bobbing to the surface to breathe, and they'd look around. It was a little nerve-wracking at first. I was really hyper. And then you start getting a little bit more bold about it. And it's like, well, they're not bothering me. So this is shot with a 14, so I'm really close to this thing. And I had seen I saw this snake come to the surface, and I was watching it, and it came to the surface and it was looking towards the land. So I kind of snuck up behind it, and I'm at 500th of a second here because I wanted to stop the motion. And I kind of swam up and just kind of pushed the camera at the snake, and it's freaked out and it's diving back down. I just love that water cascading off its tail. Again, look at the dynamic range in this photograph. You've got and I brought down the highlights, and I use a Dodge burn tool in Photoshop to bring the highlights down a little bit. It wasn't that drastic. I mean, it's interesting when you see the raw file on this. It's not heavily corrected at all. But this is the beauty of this. You have this this, and again, with the micro four thirds, the darn thing's small enough. And the beauty of this is my whole housing went in a small case that was able to go with me easily on this trip to this remote spot of the earth, instead of having to worry about, oh my gosh, you know, I've got cases on case of gear. So, you know, the equipment works for me. But I think it's a cool picture because it just brings, it captured the sense of how I saw it when it happened, with the light rays going through the water and that beautiful, they're kind of I believe they're considered a yellow banded sea crate. They have this slight coloration to them. And there's one, they told me there was I think it's more of a pronounced dark black and white coloration, that they said, well, you got to be careful because those things are kind of aggressive. I said, well, how do we know they're there? I said, well, you don't.
Well, it's really a fascinating image, especially with respect to how we've been talking about dynamic range, because of the refraction of light underwater and the disparity that they can create in terms of exposure between what's above the water and underwater. And just the fact that you're able to get that all in a single frame with minimal adjustment in post is really phenomenal.
Well, that water is so clear there. Oh my gosh, you didn't get that. You know, it's not like you see 1 foot in front of you. I mean, we're into 70 foot, maybe 50 foot visibility, which you go into a whole set of rules on underwater photography, which we don't have time to go into there. But again, you know, I think if, you know, we look at photographs and we should react to the photograph. You can always tell the kind of geeky photographer that you'll see them at the photo shows at a gallery, because they're the ones with their face 2 inches from the image. Say, well, I see some pixelation there. I see some noise. If the image is powerful enough, I'll take those components and work with them, because if the image is powerful enough, you react to the image. And that's what this is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about making the image, capturing what you see. And again, that's what I'm going to harp on it, because that's what I love about this Olympus gear, is that it gets out of the way. So I'm getting those moments that I see.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, let me get out of the this mode and get back to us. That was fantastic. I love looking at your photographs, and
well, thanks. I appreciate it.
Hearing the stories behind them. It's just phenomenal. There's a lot of stuff that you do. Where can people find out about your workshops and your photographs and everything else?
Oh boy, awesome! I get to plug myself. Yeah, we do workshops. It's First Light Workshop singular.com. First, like first light in the morning, one word, firstlightworkshop.com. We were actually, my wife and I started these workshops 12 years ago, a lot with Olympus support. They've been fantastic supporting us. And we won't go, oh, that's a whole story on its own, but we started these workshops and we've got a dedicated following. We were listed by American Photo as one of the 10 best workshops out there. That was included with Photography The Summit and Main Media and Santa Fe that do, you know, dozens of workshops a year, and we do two or three. We did Namibia last year. We're doing Mongolia this year, and we're not sure if it's going to happen. There's a lot of stuff built around a total eclipse in Wyoming, having to do with cowboys and a total eclipse. Yeah. How can you go wrong with that? We'll do Mongolia, and we kind of look at, and we're doing a smaller workshop this year to a private one. And so we do a lot of those. I do a lot of work with National Geographic expeditions and workshops and adventures. I've got a bunch. I'm heading out to Africa in February on an Africa by private jet. I know. Someone's got to do it though. But it's funny, you know. I don't look at myself, but people say, well, you know, why don't you retire? And it's like, what would I do if I retired? I'd go pay to be on trips like this to listen to some schmuck like me talk about photography. I want to be the schmuck. So I've been very, very arrogant there, but I love what I get to do. It still amazes me. I'm afraid I'm going to wake up. It's going to be 1969. I'll still be in college. It's an amazing. I feel really fortunate to get to have gotten to do this and to continue to do this. You know, I heard a great quote by somebody. I wish I could attribute it to myself, but they said, "Why don't you retire?" And this person said, "I'm not finished." I think that says it all.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dave, thank you for joining us. And thanks for everyone else for tuning in. This is the first of, I hope, a series, but I'd love to hear your feedback in terms of what you liked about today, and any suggestions that you have in terms of topics. This is not so much going to be about particular camera systems that we focused on Olympus today. I'm really interested in talking about features and how they directly relate to photographs. So if there are certain topics that you want us to talk about and discuss, please post them in the messages below. And thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time.